You ever wake up to someone screaming at you to move your own property? I did at 7 a.m. by a bleach blonde HOA tyrant named Cheryl. What she didn't know, I owned the entire lake she was protecting. By sunset, her fishing club was evicted, her authority shattered, and her secrets exposed. This is how I dismantled an HOA's corruption with a single folder of paperwork. Cheryl's screech cut through the morning calm. Move that eyesore. Her finger jabbed at my boat, my property. I sipped my coffee. Funny, you're trespassing. Move that eyesore off the water, Samuel. She shouted like she was leading a battalion. It's against HOA guidelines. I blinked, still on my porch with a mug of coffee in hand, watching mist rise off the lake. My boat, a modest aluminum fishing vessel with a small outboard, sat tied up neatly at the dock. Dock, by the way, that was on my private shoreline on my lake. See, that's the detail Cheryl didn't know. Morning, Cheryl. I called back. You want to try that again? Maybe with less yelling and more manners. She stormed up my drive like she owned the gravel under her orthopedic sandals. I don't care what you think is polite, Samuel Ellison. The HOA had a meeting and your boat violates Section 7, Article 4. No personal watercraft shall be stored or docked in community access areas. I raised an eyebrow. This dock isn't community access. Well, it's on the lake, isn't it? She snapped. That lake belongs to all of us. And your rust bucket is an eyesore. The HOA's gotten complaints from the fishing club. They say it scares off the base. I nearly dropped my coffee laughing. Scares off the base? Cheryl, that boat's quieter than your voice on karaoke night. She didn't laugh. You've got 72 hours to move it, or we'll fine you $100 per day. I nodded slowly. Right. You go ahead and do that. She turned on her heel and marched back to her golf cart. A little smug parade of entitlement in motion. I smiled. Cheryl had no idea the HOA's community lake was in my deed. Time to flip the board. Because here's the part they didn't know. 20 years ago, I bought this land from a retiring farmer. The lake came with it. I own not just the shoreline, but the entire body of water. The HOA? They never bothered to check the county records. They just assumed the lake was part of the community's green space package, and I let them believe it until now. I walked inside and pulled out the manila folder I kept in my safe, the original deed, the water rights documents, the surveyor's map. All of it crystal clear. The lake was mine. The fishing club? Trespassing. The dock? Private. And those HOA guidelines? They didn't apply to me. I had let it slide for years because I didn't care. Let them fish. Let them think they ran things. But now Cheryl and her army of clipboard warriors wanted to push me? Fine, let's push back. 72 hours to move my boat? Fine. 72 hours later, Cheryl's empire would crumble. The next morning, I put up a sign at the lake's entrance. Private property, no access without permission. That set the fire. By mid-afternoon, Cheryl was back, this time with a man in a salmon-colored polo shirt and a comb-over that looked like it had fought gravity and lost. This is Greg, she said, puffing out her chest like she was announcing a celebrity. He's the HOA vice president. Greg offered a limp handshake. Samuel, we'd like to de-escalate this. The fishing club has been using the lake for 15 years. Without permission, I said. Greg cleared his throat. Well, we assumed. You assumed wrong. I cut in. And now that you've tried to find me for keeping my boat on my own water, I'm revoking all public access. The lake's closed to HOA members, effective immediately. Cheryl's face purpled like a rotten plum. This is war, Samuel. No, I said. War requires power. You've got a golf cart and a lie. Her face went pale, then red. You can't do that. I can and did. Hope your base like deeper waters. She looked like she was going to pop a blood vessel. This is war, Samuel. Careful, I said. You start throwing around threats, and I'll get the sheriff involved. I've got every document you'll need, framed and ready. They stormed off again, Greg muttering something about checking with the board. I watched them go, then turned and walked back inside, already planning my next move because Cheryl wasn't going to stop and I wasn't going to let her win. I pulled the folder from my safe. Inside, the deed and Cheryl's resignation letter. She just didn't know it yet. By the next HOA meeting, the whole neighborhood was buzzing. Word had spread fast. The signs, the revoked access, the fact that the fishing club had been booted off their beloved weekend hangout. People were ticked, but not at me. See, once folks found out the HOA had never filed any paperwork about the lake or checked ownership, they started asking questions. Hard ones. Why were they paying dues that maintained a lake they didn't even own? Why had Cheryl spent thousands of dollars from the HOA budget on new paddle boats last year? Why would an HOA president risk felony charges over a fishing club? Turns out, $78,000 in aquatic enhancements wasn't buying bait. The fishing club was more than a casual gathering. It was Cheryl's pet project. She'd been funneling HOA funds into it for years, buying gear, stocking fish, even paying for catered events. And now that it was shut down, everyone wanted to know where their money had gone. I stayed quiet, didn't need to do anything yet. But something told me this was only the beginning. And Cheryl? She was about to dig her own grave. 3 days passed before I heard anything official. And when I did, it came in the form of a thick, overly formal letter folded into an envelope with the HOA's logo stamped on the upper left corner, like it was some kind of royal decree. The envelope was taped to my front door, not mailed, taped. That told me everything I needed to know about what kind of circus this was becoming. The letter accused me of unauthorized restriction of community resources, obstruction of scheduled recreational activity, and my personal favorite, uncooperative behavior detrimental to neighborhood harmony. It was signed by Cheryl and 3 other board members whose names I barely recognized. I read the letter twice, set it down on my kitchen table, and poured myself a glass of sweet tea. They were doubling down. That meant they were scared. I made a few phone calls that afternoon, not to lawyers yet, but to the county assessor's office and the Environmental Commission. I wanted every record that had ever touched that lake. I pulled up the land plat, reviewed the water use rights, found an old zoning commission note from 32 years ago that confirmed the lake had never been annexed as common property when the neighborhood was developed. It stayed with the original parcel, which, lucky me, I had bought outright. The next morning, I noticed something strange. A group of men in orange vests standing near the lake's edge on the southern side. They were pounding in stakes and unrolling what looked like nylon fencing. I walked down with my phone recording in my shirt pocket. Morning, I called out, "What's going on here?" One of the workers turned, clearly not thrilled to see me. Just installing a temporary barrier. We were told by the HOA there's going to be shoreline restoration happening this week. I blinked. On whose side of the lake? Yeah, he said. All this stretch up to the bend. That's private land. Who gave you permission? The HOA president. Cheryl something. I held up my hand. I need you to stop immediately. This is trespassing. I own this property. If you touch anything else, I'll have to call the sheriff. He looked between me and the stakes already driven into the ground. We're just following orders, man. I'd get that. But the people giving you those orders are overstepping their authority. You can either pack up peacefully or you can explain it to law enforcement. The guy side muttered something to the others, and within 20 minutes, they were rolling up the fencing and hauling the stakes back to their truck. I stood there the whole time, arms crossed. When they pulled away, I noticed Cheryl standing across the street near her golf cart, arms folded, watching like some kind of suburban sentry. I didn't wave. I didn't nod. Just turned and walked back to my dock. That afternoon, I filed a formal complaint with the sheriff's office, citing attempted land encroachment and unauthorized construction. They took it seriously. Not because the HOA had sent workers, they saw that sort of power play all the time, but because I had documentation, deeds, maps, surveyor stamps. The kind of airtight paperwork that didn't leave room for interpretation. Two deputies visited Cheryl the following morning. I watched from my porch as they knocked on her door and spent a good 20 minutes speaking with her and Greg, who had apparently been summoned for backup. Cheryl's arms flailed wildly as she talked. Greg kept looking at the ground like he wished he could disappear into it. After the deputies left, Cheryl didn't come storming up my drive. She didn't say a word. But 2 hours later, I got an email from a neighbor named Rachel. She wanted to talk. Rachel lived on the east side of the neighborhood and had been on the HOA board for about 6 months. She was the treasurer, technically. According to her, Cheryl had slowly pushed her out of the loop over the past few months, locking down financial data and refusing to let her review purchase orders. I started getting suspicious after she approved a $3,500 line item labeled Aquatic Resource Enhancement, Rachel said when we met at the local diner that evening, but she wouldn't explain what it was. Just brushed me off and said it was for the fishing club. I raised an eyebrow. You know that club's been using my lake without permission? I do now, she said. Look, I'm not a pushover, but Cheryl's been intimidating people. She uses the bylaws like a weapon. So you're saying there might be more financial mismanagement than just paddle boats and catered fish fries? Rachel nodded and slid a folder across the table. Here's everything I was able to print before she changed the login credentials. I flipped through the sheets. Vendor payments with no matching invoices, checks cut to companies with generic names like Lake Works and Shoreline Solutions. Several of them had been endorsed by someone named Kyle B. I didn't recognize the name. You know this guy? I asked. No, Rachel said, but I ran the address on one of the checks. It doesn't lead to any office. It's a residential apartment 2 towns over. I leaned back in the booth, thinking, you want to blow the whistle, don't you? I do, but I need help. If I go at her alone, she'll bury me in procedural nonsense. Then let's not go at her alone, I said. Let's go public. We gave it 72 hours. During that time, I gathered my own set of documents, photos of the fencing crew on my land, copies of the original deed, a timeline of events. Rachel assembled a spreadsheet comparing all the HOA's budgeted expenses against actual financial records over the past 2 years. Then we sent out letters. Not emails, not social media posts, actual letters, delivered by hand to every single household in the neighborhood. Inside each one was a summary of what had happened, a list of HOA expenditures that Rachel had flagged, and a request for residents to attend an emergency open meeting at the community center the following Saturday. The turnout was bigger than we expected. Over 60 people packed into the space, some standing along the walls. Cheryl and her cronies sat in the front row, their expressions tight and unreadable. Rachel stepped up first. She spoke clearly, calmly, laying out the discrepancies in the budget, bypassed approvals, the unauthorized spending. Then I stepped forward and explained how the HOA had been using a lake they didn't own, how they tried to fine me for storing a boat on my own property, and how they'd sent contractors to erect fencing without any legal authority. The room went quiet. Then someone near the back, an older man in a flannel jacket, stood up and said, "Where's the money now?" Rachel answered, "We don't know, but we're going to find out." That's when Cheryl stood. Her voice was sharp but shaky. This is a personal attack. These two are trying to undermine the HOA because they don't like how things are run. Another neighbor stood, then another, and another. Questions flew. Why had Cheryl refused to share financial records? Why were permits never filed for shoreline work? Why was a private lake treated like a public park? Cheryl tried to shout over the crowd, but the momentum had turned. By the end of the meeting, a motion had been made and passed to suspend Cheryl pending a full audit. Greg resigned quietly before the motion even finished. A temporary committee formed, with Rachel appointed as acting chair. The following week, the HOA's bank statements were subpoenaed. Turns out Kyle B. was Cheryl's nephew. He'd been paid over $18,000 for consulting work that never happened. The sheriff's office opened an investigation. Cheryl was arrested for embezzlement and misuse of community funds. Her house went up for sale within a month. And the lake? I reopened it for use on one condition. Anyone who wanted to fish or paddle or even just enjoy the water had to sign a liability waiver and follow the rules I set. No exceptions, no shortcuts. Funny thing happened after that. People started knocking on my door not to complain, just to say thanks. For standing up, for pulling back the curtain, for not backing down when the HOA tried to rewrite reality. Rachel and I still meet up every now and then. She's still chair of the new HOA board, and this time they know exactly where the boundaries are because they finally bothered to read the map. 2 weeks after Cheryl's arrest, the neighborhood was still buzzing, only now the conversations were quieter, more cautious, like everyone was waiting for the next shoe to drop. And it did, in the form of a subpoena. A uniformed deputy knocked on my door one morning with a manila envelope in hand. Samuel Ellison? I nodded. You're listed as a primary witness in an ongoing investigation into financial misconduct involving the Lakewood Trails Homeowners Association. The district attorney's office is requesting your cooperation. I took the envelope, signed where he pointed, and waited for him to leave before opening it. Inside was an official court summons, a list of requested documents, and a note from the DA's office outlining the scope of the investigation: embezzlement, misuse of HOA dues, falsification of community records, and this one caught my eye: attempted land fraud. Apparently, Cheryl had filed paperwork with the county zoning office 6 months prior, attempting to annex the lake into the HOA's shared space. She'd forged surveyor signatures and submitted a doctored map that showed the lake as unclaimed municipal water. The only reason it hadn't gone through was because a clerk noticed that the map didn't match the county's archival survey records and flagged it for review. That forged map? It had my property marked as undeveloped green space. She tried to erase my name from the land entirely. The DA's investigator, a man named Langford, reached out the next day. He asked if I'd be willing to sit for a recorded statement and walk them through the timeline of events. I agreed. We met in a conference room on the second floor of the county courthouse. Langford was sharp-eyed, calm, and meticulous. He didn't ask the same thing twice. He didn't need to. Mr. Ellison, he said, were you ever informed by the HOA or any of its representatives about this annexation attempt? No, I said. Not a word. If they'd asked, I would have told them immediately it wasn't legal. He nodded. And at any point, did you give written or verbal consent for them to use your lake as a community amenity? Never. I tolerated it because it didn't bother me until they tried to fine me for using my own property. Langford's pen didn't stop moving the entire time. And the fencing crew, did they have any permits? None. I asked them directly. They were hired under false pretenses. He leaned back slightly. You're aware that under state law, forging land use documents and submitting them to a public office carries not just civil penalties, but felony charges? I met his gaze. I am now. Langford closed his notebook. We've already arrested Cheryl. We're preparing to indict 2 other board members. But there's something else. One of the companies that received multiple HOA checks, Shoreline Solutions, was traced back to a shell corporation. It connects to a bank account in Georgia. That account was opened by a man using a fake name, but security footage shows Cheryl entering the bank branch the day it was created. I frowned. So she was laundering money? That's what we believe. We're working with the State Financial Crimes Unit to build the case. Your testimony is going to be critical, and your documentation, the original deed, the water rights, that's what stopped this from going a lot further. When I left the courthouse, the air felt heavier. Not in a bad way, just weightier, like something big had shifted and couldn't be undone. Back in the neighborhood, Rachel was knee-deep in damage control. The temporary board had hired a forensic accountant to audit the last 5 years of HOA spending. What they found peeled back the curtain even further. Cheryl hadn't just misused funds for the fishing club. She'd approved payments to a landscaping company that didn't exist, authorized purchases for community improvement materials that no one ever saw, and even reimbursed herself for legal consultations that were never invoiced. All told, the missing money totaled over $78,000. I stopped by Rachel's house a few evenings later. Her front porch light flickered slightly, and her dog, a sleepy basset hound named Red, watched me from under a rocking chair. I figured you'd want to see this, she said, holding out a thin stack of pages. It's the preliminary report from the accountant. I scanned the report. She really thought no one would check. She counted on people being too tired or distracted. You'd be amazed how easy it is to hide things in plain sight when everyone's busy with kids or work. I looked up. What's the board going to do now? We're holding a full revote next month. New bylaws, new oversight procedures, and we're going to recommend dissolving the fishing club permanently. No more side projects with community funds. Good, I said. What about restitution? Rachel gave a slight shake of her head. That'll be up to the court. 3 days later, a county grand jury handed down indictments. Cheryl was charged with 7 felony counts, including forgery, fraud, and criminal misappropriation of funds. 2 other board members, Greg and a woman named Elaine, were charged with conspiracy and knowingly approving false expenditures. The trial was scheduled for late fall. In the meantime, the neighborhood was changing. Not in grand ways, but in small, steady shifts. Neighbors who used to keep to themselves started talking more. A group of teenagers previously discouraged from hanging out near the lake held a community cleanup day and filled 4 contractor bags with old fishing line and cans. Someone hung a wooden sign at the end of the new walking trail, "Respect what's real." I started getting invited to things, barbecues, birthdays, even a trivia night at the community center. I didn't say yes to everything, but the invitations mattered. One afternoon, an older gentleman named Harold flagged me down while I was checking the dock ropes. "I've lived here since the first house was built," he said. "Always figured that lake was just part of the package." "Most folks did," I replied. He looked out over the water. "I'm glad you didn't let them take it. People like Cheryl, they think they can rewrite the truth if they just speak loud enough." "They almost did," I said, "but a lie doesn't hold up well against paperwork." As the trial approached, the DA's office asked me to appear as their opening witness. I agreed. On the day of testimony, I wore the same boots I'd worn the morning Cheryl first screamed about my boat. It felt fitting. The courtroom was packed. Cheryl sat at the defense table in a navy suit, her expression unreadable. She avoided my eyes. Langford led the questioning. I laid out the timeline, presented the original deed, explained the trespass by the fencing crew, and confirmed I had never granted access or usage rights. When he finished, the defense attorney stood. He was younger than I expected, with slicked back hair and a voice like a commercial narrator. "Mr. Ellison," he began, "do you harbor any personal animosity toward my client?" "Not until she tried to claim I didn't own my land." "So your testimony today is motivated by a desire to retaliate?" "No," I said. "It's motivated by a desire for truth and boundaries." His tone sharpened. "Is it possible you misunderstood the HOA's intentions regarding the lake?" "No. I read the forged annexation map myself. My name was erased from it." He hesitated. "You claim the HOA used your lake for years without permission. Why didn't you stop them sooner?" "Because I didn't care until they tried to find me for using it myself." He stepped back, clearly unsatisfied. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Ellison, you may step down." The courtroom held its breath as the sheriff handed Cheryl the subpoena. Her scream? Finally HOA compliant. The trial lasted 4 days. The prosecution presented emails, financial records, and video footage from the bank. Cheryl never took the stand. In the end, the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours, guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 8 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 5. Greg and Elaine both received probation and were barred from serving on any HOA board again. After the sentencing, Rachel organized a neighborhood gathering, not a celebration, just a way to mark the end of a long, strange chapter. People brought food, kids played by the shore, and for the first time in a long while, there was no tension in the air. As dusk settled over the lake, I stood by the edge, watching water ripple with the breeze. Rachel joined me, holding 2 cups of lemonade. "You think the neighborhood's going to be okay?" she asked. "I think it already is," I said. "People just needed to be reminded that power doesn't mean truth, and that you don't get to redraw the map just because you don't like what's on it." She smiled. "You know, you could run for the board. People would vote for you." I shook my head. "I've got what I need right here." And I looked out at the lake, still a steady reflection of what couldn't be taken. It was nearly winter by the time the last of the fishing gear was cleared from the lake's edge. The aluminum rowboats, the makeshift wooden racks, even the weather-beaten tackle box that had been nailed to a tree all vanished, carted off quietly by whoever still had the nerve to come back after the trial. No one asked to use the lake anymore. No one tried to. The cold settled in slow that year. A thin frost began to glaze the dock planks each morning, and the water grew stiller than I'd ever seen it. The neighborhood had quieted too, not in a defeated way, but like a dust-covered house after a storm's passed. People waved more. There was a strange kind of gratitude in their routines now, like they finally understood just how close things had come to falling apart entirely. One morning, just before the first real snow was forecast to hit, I found a single sheet of paper folded under my windshield wiper. It was typed. No signature, no name. "You may have stopped Cheryl, but not everyone on that board was innocent. You should look into the old equipment shed behind the tennis courts." I stared at it for a long minute before folding it again and slipping it into my jacket. I hadn't even thought about that shed in years. It was half sunk into the tree lean behind the community center, mostly forgotten. The tennis courts hadn't been resurfaced in at least a decade. Later that day, I drove over and parked near the center's back lot. The shed was still there, steel rusted at the hinges, with a heavy padlock on the door. I walked the perimeter. No footprints in the leaves, no sign of recent use. But when I tried the handle, the entire door wobbled slightly on its bolts. The lock was just for show. I pried it open with a crowbar from my trunk. Inside, dust drifted in thick waves through the sunlight slicing in from a broken vent. Old folding chairs, a busted push mower, a stack of faded pool safety signs. Nothing jumped out at first. Then I saw the plastic bins tucked behind a false panel of particle board near the back. 3 of them, each labeled with a strip of masking tape, event supplies. I popped the lids. The first was full of envelopes. Hundreds of them, all unopened, bundled by rubber bands. HOA dues checks. Some dated as far back as 3 years ago. The names on the envelopes were all familiar neighbors, retirees, young couples from the newer part of the subdivision. I recognized at least 15 people I knew personally. The second bin was stuffed with bank slips, deposit stubs, but the account numbers didn't match the HOA's known records. I took out my phone and snapped photos of everything, every page, every slip. Third bin held something different. 2 black notebooks filled with handwritten notes, meeting logs, but not official ones. These were more like a running diary. Pages and pages, all in the same messy cursive. I flipped to the middle and started reading. Greg agreed to the transfer plan. Elaine, still nervous, told her no paper trail. Kyle handled the rest. I kept flipping, more name amounts, mentions of quiet reimbursements, and offsite funding. One page detailed a plan to phase out Ellison's claim entirely, a reference to me, no doubt. It listed county offices, the name of a clerk, even an estimate of how long to expect pushback. I closed the notebook and stepped outside. The cold hit harder after that. I took everything. Bins, notebooks, envelopes. They filled the backseat of my truck. The next day, I handed it all over to Langford at the DA's office. He read through the first few pages of one of the notebooks right there in the parking lot before looking up at me. This changes things. A week later, new subpoenas went out. Two more former board members were arrested. Elaine again, this time on new charges, and another man named Harris, who'd served as secretary until last year. The DA added obstruction, mail fraud, and conspiracy to the growing list of charges tied to the HOA's collapsed leadership. But the real blow came from the bank records tied to those checks. Langford called me in again, this time with two agents from the state's financial crimes unit present. One of them, a woman named Owens, laid it out plainly. There was a second account opened in the HOA's name, she said, completely unauthorized. It wasn't tied to the organization's tax ID. Someone forged the creation documents and began depositing member dues into it, starting 4 years ago. I just shook my head. So they were siphoning from the start? Longer than we thought, she said. The total amount deposited into that shadow account exceeds $118,000. Langford added, and not a cent of it was used for legitimate community expenses. It went toward personal travel, home renovations, even private school tuition for Cheryl's niece. They traced the money trail all the way to a shell company in Florida, but the trail ended there. Whoever set it up knew how to cover tracks. Still, it was enough. The judge granted the DA's motion to pursue full asset forfeiture. Cheryl's remaining property, her car, savings account, even her family's lake house in Michigan, was seized and liquidated. The funds were placed into a restitution pool for the affected residents. But there was still the matter of the HOA itself. Rachel approached me one afternoon in early spring as I was restaining the dock. She had a thick binder in her hands and a worried look in her eyes. I've spent the last month working with the interim board and auditor, she said. We've come to a conclusion. I set my brush down. What kind? We're recommending the HOA dissolve entirely legally, permanently. I blinked. You can do that? It's a long process. Requires a supermajority vote, approval from the county registrar, and a full redistribution of community assets under state supervision. But yes, we can. I considered that for a moment, then nodded. And what happens to everything? The community center, the walking trails, the green space. We're proposing a neighborhood trust, independent nonprofit, no enforcement powers, just maintenance, funded voluntarily. I let out a breath. It was more than I had hoped for. The vote was held 2 weeks later. Out of 243 eligible homeowners, 227 voted in favor, well past the threshold for dissolution. The HOA was officially terminated that summer. For the first time in nearly 2 decades, the neighborhood stood on its own. No board, no fines, no unaccountable leadership, just people learning how to be neighbors again. Rachel's proposed trust was approved shortly after. I helped draft the charter, though I declined a seat on the board. I had my lake, my dock, and peace. That was enough. At the final community meeting held in the old center before it was rebranded under the new trust, Rachel stood and read a statement aloud, one I hadn't seen before. Let this serve as a reminder, she said, that power is not a license to control, and no title, office, or clipboard gives you the right to rewrite the truth. The room stayed silent after that, not out of fear or respect. As people filed out, I lingered near the door. Harold passed by with 2 cups of cider and handed me one. Funny thing, he said. I always thought that lake just made for a nice view. It's more than a view, I told him. It's a boundary and a mirror. He raised his cup, to never letting anyone else forget that. We clinked the paper cups together. Later that evening, as I sat on the end of the dock with the sun bleeding gold across the water, I thought about how close it had all come to slipping away. Not just my land, but the truth itself. The community had been on the edge of becoming something hollow, but not anymore. Now the lake was still, and this time it belonged to everyone who respected it and no one who tried to own it. Ever dealt with an HOA bully? Remember, their power is paper thin. Sometimes All it takes is one person with the receipts.